The sound of weeping pierced through the thin walls of the boarding house like a knife through butter, and Martha Henderson pressed her pillow over her ears for the third night in a row, wondering when the new widow next door would finally run out of tears. It was late summer in 1877, and the small mining town of Silver Creek, Colorado, had seen its share of tragedy. But something about the relentless sobbing of the young woman in room 14 made even the hardest hearts in the establishment feel a twinge of sympathy mixed with growing irritation. The boarding house sat on the edge of town where the main street gave way to wilderness, a 2-story wooden structure that creaked and groaned with every gust of mountain wind. Martha was not alone in her frustration. By the end of the first week, nearly every resident had complained to Mrs. Beatrice Caldwell, the stern-faced proprietress who ran the establishment with an iron fist and a surprisingly soft heart. "That poor girl needs to get hold of herself," grumbled old Pete Hannigan, a former prospector who had lost his leg in a mining accident and now spent his days whittling figurines on the front porch. "Ain't natural, all that crying. Going to make herself sick." Mrs. Caldwell wiped her hands on her apron and sighed deeply. She had tried everything she could think of to console the young widow. She had brought her soup, offered her tea, sat with her in silence, but nothing seemed to penetrate the wall of grief that surrounded Clara Hartwell like a fortress. The girl had arrived in Silver Creek 3 weeks earlier with her husband, a bright-eyed prospector named Thomas Hartwell, who had heard rumors of a new silver vein in the mountains. They had been married less than a year, childhood sweethearts from Ohio who had decided to seek their fortune out west. Thomas had been 24, Clara only 22, and they had looked at each other with the kind of love that made even cynical old miners believe in romance. Then, barely 2 weeks after their arrival, Thomas had been killed in a rock slide while exploring an old mine shaft. His body had been recovered and buried in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking town, and Clara had not stopped crying since. She took her meals in her room when she could be persuaded to eat at all, and the constant sound of her weeping had become a fixture of life at the boarding house, why as regular and unwelcome as the whistle from the stamp mill that processed ore down by the creek. "Someone needs to do something," Martha Henderson declared at breakfast one morning, her face drawn and pale from lack of sleep. "I have got compassion for the girl, truly I do, but I cannot function on 2 hours of rest a night. My work is suffering." Martha was a seamstress who took in mending and alterations from the townspeople, and her tired eyes and shaking hands were making it difficult to thread a needle, let alone create the fine stitches her reputation depended upon. Several other boarders nodded in agreement, their faces equally haggard. Even kind-hearted Reverend Michaels, who had conducted Thomas Hartwell's funeral service, looked worn down by the constant sound of mourning. "I have tried speaking with her," he said gently, and he's stirring sugar into his coffee. "I have offered spiritual counsel, prayer, the comfort of Scripture. She listens politely, but nothing I say seems to reach her. The grief has taken hold of her completely." Mrs. Caldwell set down a platter of eggs and bacon with more force than necessary. "Well, something has to be done. The girl is wasting away to nothing, and the rest of you are about to collapse from exhaustion. I am running a boarding house, not a sanatorium." It was at that moment that the front door opened, and a massive figure filled the doorway, blocking out the morning sunlight. Every head turned to look at the newcomer, and more than one person caught their breath. The man who entered had to duck his head to clear the frame, and his shoulders were so broad they nearly touched both sides of the doorway. But he stood well over 6 feet tall, with a powerful build that spoke of years spent in hard physical labor. His hair was dark brown and hung past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his face was weathered and tanned from constant exposure to the elements. He wore buckskin trousers, heavy boots, and a simple homespun shirt that strained across a chest as solid as the mountains themselves. A thick beard covered his jaw, and his eyes were a startling shade of blue that seemed to take in everything at once. "Morning," he said in a deep rumbling voice that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "Name is Nathaniel Cross. Looking for a room if you have one available." Mrs. Caldwell recovered her composure first. She had seen plenty of rough men come through Silver Creek, but there was something different about this one. Despite his intimidating size and wild appearance, There was a calm steadiness in his demeanor that suggested intelligence and self-control. "We have rooms available, Mr. Cross," she said, wiping her hands on her apron again, a nervous habit she fell into when flustered. "How long are you planning to stay?" "Not sure yet," Nathaniel replied, stepping further into the dining room. His movements were surprisingly graceful for a man of his size, like a bear moving through the forest. "Depends on whether I find what I'm looking for. I'm a tracker and hunter, and I heard there might be work in these parts. Also thinking about staking a claim if the land looks promising." "There is plenty of work for a man with your skills," old Pete spoke up from his corner table. "Mountain lions have been troubling the ranches east of here, and the mine owners are always looking for fresh meat for their workers. You will have no shortage of employment if you are as good as you look." Nathaniel nodded his thanks and turned his attention back to Mrs. Caldwell. "I will take whatever room you have. I'm not particular." Mrs. Caldwell hesitated for just a moment, and an idea began to form in her mind. It was bold, perhaps even inappropriate, but desperate times called for desperate measures. "I have a room available on the second floor, number 15. It is right next to another guest, a young widow. I feel I should warn you that she has recently suffered a terrible loss, and she cries quite often during the night. If you prefer, I could offer you the room at the back of the house where it would be quieter." Nathaniel's blue eyes studied Mrs. Caldwell's face for a long moment, and she had the distinct impression that he could see straight through her poorly disguised scheme. "Room 15 will be fine," he said finally. "Grief is nothing to be ashamed of. I will not be disturbed." A collective sigh of disappointment went through the room. The other boarders had been hoping the mountain man might be scared off by the warning, leaving the best room in the house available for one of them to claim. But Mrs. Caldwell felt a flutter of hope in her chest. Perhaps this quiet giant of a man might succeed where everyone else had failed. Nathaniel paid for 2 weeks in advance with coins that clinked heavily on the wooden counter, collected his key, and headed upstairs with his pack slung over one massive shoulder. He found room 15 easily enough and let himself in, setting his belongings down on the simple bed. The room was clean and functional, with a washstand, a small wardrobe, a chair by the window, and little else. He did not need much. He had spent most of the last 8 years living in the mountains, trapping and hunting, visiting civilization only when he needed supplies or wanted human company. He was 30 years old and had left his family's farm in Montana after a devastating wildfire had killed his parents and destroyed everything they had built. The grief had driven him into the wilderness, and he had found a kind of peace in the solitude of the high country. But lately, he'd been feeling restless, as though the mountains were no longer enough. He had begun to wonder what it might be like to put down roots again, to build something lasting, perhaps even to find someone to share his life with. And those thoughts had led him down from his usual territory into Colorado, following rumors of opportunities in the mining districts. He unpacked his few possessions, washed the trail dust from his face and hands, and sat down in the chair by the window to clean his rifle. The view looked out over the main street of Silver Creek, such as it was. The town was small but growing, with a general store, a saloon, a church, a livery stable, and various other businesses that catered to the miners and ranchers who made up the majority of the population. Mountains rose up on all sides, their peaks still dotted with snow even in late summer, and pine forests covered the slopes like a thick green blanket. He was running an oiled cloth along the barrel of his rifle when he heard it, a soft, muffled sobbing coming through the wall to his left. The sound was so full of anguish and despair that it made his chest tighten. He had heard men cry before, usually after they had been wounded in fights or accidents, but this was different. This was the sound of a soul that had been shattered into pieces and did not know how to put itself back together. Nathaniel set down his rifle and walked to the wall, pressing his hand flat against the rough boards. The crying continued, punctuated by gasping breaths and occasional words he could not quite make out. He stood there for several minutes, listening, and felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness toward the unknown woman on the other side of the wall. He did not know her name or her story, but he recognized the sound of someone who was drowning and could not find the surface. That night, as darkness fell over Silver Creek and the boarding house settled into quiet, the crying began again in earnest. Nathaniel lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the heart-wrenching sobs that seemed to go on forever. He heard movement in the hallway, frustrated footsteps and muttered complaints from other boarders who could not sleep. Someone knocked on the widow's door and called out in an annoyed voice, "Please, for the love of God, try to control yourself." But the crying only grew worse, more desperate and raw. Nathaniel threw back his blankets and stood up, pulling on his trousers and shirt. He had never been one to stand by when someone was suffering, even if it was none of his business. He stepped out into the dimly lit hallway, lit by a single oil lamp on a small table, and stood in front of room 14. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What was he going to say? What could he possibly offer that would help? He was a man of action, not words. He could track a deer through a snowstorm, bring down an elk at 200 yards, survive in the wilderness with nothing but a knife and his wits. But comforting a grieving widow was far outside his area of expertise. Still, he could not just walk away. He knocked softly on the door, 3 gentle raps that would not startle her. The crying paused for a moment, then continued. He knocked again, a little louder. "Ma'am," he called out, keeping his voice low and calm. "My name is Nathaniel Cross. I'm staying in the room next to yours. I do not mean to intrude, but I wanted to check if you are all right." It was a foolish question. Obviously, she was not all right. But he did not know what else to say. There was a long silence, and then a small, trembling voice answered from the other side of the door. "Please, just leave me alone. I'm sorry for disturbing everyone, but I cannot seem to stop. Please, just go away." Her voice was hoarse from crying, rough and broken, but there was a quality to it that made Nathaniel's heart ache. "I'm not here to complain, ma'am," he said quietly. "I'm here because no one should have to face that kind of pain alone. You do not have to let me in, and you do not have to talk to me, but I am going to stay right here until I know you are safe. That is all. Just want to make sure you are safe." There was another long silence, and Nathaniel wondered if she had decided to ignore him completely. Yet he was about to sit down with his back against the door when he heard the sound of feet shuffling across the floor, and then the lock clicked and the door opened just a crack. A young woman's face appeared in the gap, pale and drawn, with red-rimmed eyes and tear-stained cheeks. Her hair was dark brown and hung in tangled waves around her shoulders, and she wore a simple nightgown covered by a shawl. Even in her current state, Nathaniel could see that she had delicate features, and would have been pretty if not for the obvious ravages of grief. "I am not going to hurt myself, if that is what you are worried about," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am just sad, so terribly, unbearably sad. My husband died, and I do not know how to live without him." Nathaniel met her eyes, those dark brown eyes that were swimming with tears, and spoke with absolute sincerity. "I know what it is like to lose everyone you love. 8 years ago, my parents died in a fire that destroyed our farm. I thought the grief would kill me. Some days I wished it would. But I'm still here, and I can tell you that it does get easier. Not better exactly, but easier to carry." Clara stared at him, this massive stranger who spoke of loss with such quiet understanding, and something in his words penetrated the fog of her grief. "How?" she whispered. "How do you keep going?" "One breath at a time," Nathaniel replied. "One moment at a time. And sometimes, when it gets too heavy to carry alone, you let someone else help shoulder the burden for a little while." He paused, then added gently, "Would you like me to sit with you? Just sit. You do not have to talk if you do not want to. But maybe having someone nearby would help." Clara hesitated, propriety warring with desperation. She had been raised to believe that inviting a man into her room was scandalous, especially a man she did not know. But she was so tired of being alone with her grief, so exhausted from fighting the waves of sorrow that kept crashing over her. And there was something about this quiet giant that made her feel safe rather than threatened. "All right," she said finally, opening the door wider. "Just for a little while." Nathaniel stepped into the small room, which was nearly identical to his own. Clara gestured to the chair by the window, and he sat down carefully, the wood creaking under his weight. She perched on the edge of the bed, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. When Nathaniel simply sat there, his presence filling the room like a solid, reassuring anchor, and gradually Clara felt some of the frantic energy that had been driving her endless tears begin to subside. "Tell me about him," Nathaniel said after a while. "Your husband. What was his name?" "Thomas," Clara replied, and just saying his name brought fresh tears to her eyes, but these were gentler somehow, not the wild, gasping sobs that had been tearing her apart. "Thomas Hartwell. We grew up together in Ohio. He was kind and funny, and had all these big dreams about striking it rich out west so we could build a beautiful house and raise a family. We had only been married 10 months when he died." "What do you remember most about him?" Nathaniel asked, his deep voice soft and encouraging. Clara closed her eyes, and a small, sad smile touched her lips. His laugh. He had this wonderful, infectious laugh that made everyone around him happy, and the way he looked at me, like I was the most amazing thing he had ever seen. He used to bring me wildflowers, silly little bouquets that would wilt within a day, but he would bring them anyway because he knew they made me smile. As she talked about Thomas, more memories came flooding back, and with them came tears, but they were different now. She was crying, yes, but she was also smiling, remembering the good times as well as mourning the loss. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making a small sound of acknowledgement, and his steady presence seemed to give Clara permission to feel everything without judgment. Hours passed, and Clara talked until her voice grew hoarse and her eyes grew heavy. She told Nathaniel about her childhood, about falling in love with Thomas, about their wedding and their journey west. She told him about the moment she had learned of Thomas's death, how the mine foreman had come to the boarding house with his hat in his hands and that terrible expression on his face, and how her whole world had collapsed in an instant. Finally, when the first light of dawn was beginning to show through the window, Clara's words trailed off and she slumped against her pillow, utterly exhausted. "I am so tired," she whispered, "but every time I close my eyes, I see him dying, crushed under those rocks, and I cannot bear it." Nathaniel stood up from the chair and moved to kneel beside the bed, bringing himself down to her eye level despite his size. "Listen to me, Clara," he said, using her name for the first time. "Your husband is not suffering. He is at peace. The only person in pain right now is you, and I promise you he would not want that. He would want you to heal, to find joy again, to live the life he cannot." "But how can I be happy when he is gone?" Clara asked, her voice breaking. "Not happy, not yet," Nathaniel said gently. "But maybe, just for tonight, you could rest. You could close your eyes and think about something good, something that makes you feel peaceful. And I will stay right here, in this chair, and make sure you are safe while you sleep. Nothing bad is going to happen to you tonight. I give you my word." Clara looked into those steady blue eyes and found herself believing him. There was a strength in Nathaniel that went beyond his physical size, a core of absolute reliability that made her feel protected for the first time since Thomas's death. "You would do that?" she asked. "Stay with me?" "I would," Nathaniel confirmed, "and I will keep doing it every night if necessary, until you can sleep without fear." Fresh tears spilled down Clara's cheeks, but these were tears of gratitude rather than despair. "Thank you," she whispered. "I do not even know you, but thank you." Nathaniel returned to the chair and settled his large frame as comfortably as possible in the small seat. "Try to rest now," he said. "I will be right here." Clara lay back on her pillow, pulling the blanket up to her chin, and for the first time in weeks she felt the tight knot of panic in her chest begin to loosen. She closed her eyes and focused on her breathing, on the sound of Nathaniel's steady presence in the chair, on the knowledge that she was not alone, and slowly, miraculously, she drifted off to sleep. Nathaniel watched over her as the sun rose, bathing the small room in golden light. He did not move from the chair, did not make a sound that might disturb her rest. His back ached and his legs cramped, but he ignored the discomfort. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. When Mrs. Caldwell came knocking on Clara's door at 8 o'clock with a breakfast tray, she was shocked to find Nathaniel answering it. He stepped out into the hallway, closing the door quietly behind him, and held a finger to his lips. "She is sleeping," he said in a low voice. "First real sleep she has had in weeks, I would wager. Best not to wake her." "Mrs. Caldwell's eyes were wide with surprise and more than a little concern. "Mr. Cross, you have been in there all night? Alone with her? Do you have any idea how that will look?" I have an idea, Nathaniel replied calmly, but I care more about her well-being than I do about gossip. She needed help, and I provided it. That is all. Mrs. Caldwell studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She had been running a boarding house long enough to be a fair judge of character, and she saw no deception or impropriety in Nathaniel's expression, only genuine concern. "Very well," she said. "I will leave the breakfast tray here. When she wakes, make sure she eats something. The poor girl has been wasting away." "I will," Nathaniel promised, taking the tray. He returned to the room and set the tray on the small table near the window. Beatrice then resumed his position in the chair. Clara slept on, her breathing deep and even, her face relaxed for the first time since he had seen her. He allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. It was a start, at least, one night of peace out of many nights of torment. It was not much, but it was something. Clara woke in the early afternoon, disoriented and confused. For a moment she could not remember where she was or why she felt so heavy and exhausted. Then memory came flooding back, along with the familiar crushing weight of grief, but this time it was bearable. She turned her head and saw Nathaniel still sitting in the chair, though he had moved it back by the window and appeared to be whittling a piece of wood with a small knife. "You stayed," she said, her voice rough with sleep and surprise. Nathaniel looked up and set aside his project. "I said I would. How are you feeling?" Clara considered the question carefully. "Tired," she admitted, "and sad, but not as desperate as I was. Is that strange?" "Not strange at all," Nathaniel assured her. "You slept for nearly 6 hours without waking. That alone will make a difference. There is food here for you. Mrs. Caldwell brought it this morning. It is cold now, but it is still good." Clara sat up slowly and accepted the plate of eggs and toast that Nathaniel handed her. She picked at it half-heartedly at first, then discovered she was actually hungry and ate with more enthusiasm. Nathaniel watched with approval, noting the slight color that returned to her cheeks as she ate. "What are you making?" Clara asked, gesturing to the piece of wood in his hands. "A bird," Nathaniel replied, holding it up so she could see the rough shape beginning to emerge. "A sparrow. My father taught me to whittle when I was a boy. It helps me think." "May I see it when you are finished?" Clara asked shyly. "You may have it when I am finished," Nathaniel said. "Consider it a gift from a new friend." Clara's eyes filled with tears again, but she blinked them back. "You're very kind, Mr. Cross. I do not know how to thank you." "Call me Nathaniel," he said, "and you do not need to thank me. Just promise me you will take care of yourself. Eat regular meals, get some fresh air. Try to sleep at night. Can you do that?" "I will try," Clara said softly. "But the nights are so hard. The darkness seems to make everything worse." "Then I will come back tonight," Nathaniel said simply. "And every night after that until you do not need me anymore, if that is all right with you." Clara felt a rush of emotion that was part relief, part gratitude, and part something else she could not quite identify. "You would do that? But why? You do not know me. You have no obligation to me." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "When my parents died, I ran away from everyone who tried to help me. I spent 8 years alone in the mountains, convinced that isolation was the answer to grief. But all it did was preserve the pain, keep it fresh and raw. I do not want that for you. You deserve better. And maybe in some small way, helping you is a way of making peace with my own past." His words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable, in a way that Clara had not expected from such a physically imposing man. She realized that beneath his size and strength, Nathaniel was someone who understood suffering intimately and had chosen compassion as his response to it. "Thank you, Nathaniel," she said, using his given name for the first time. "I would be grateful for your company tonight if you truly do not mind." "I do not mind," Nathaniel assured her. He stood up, his head nearly brushing the ceiling, and stretched his cramped muscles. "I'm going to get some rest in my own room now, and I need to speak with the sheriff about work. But I will be back this evening. Will you be all right until then?" Clara nodded, feeling stronger than she had in weeks. "I will be all right. I think I might even go outside for a little while, get some sun on my face." "Good," Nathaniel said with a smile that transformed his rugged features, each making him look younger and less severe. The mountains are beautiful this time of year. It would be a shame to miss them. He let himself out of her room, and Clara listened to his heavy footsteps receding down the hallway. Then she rose from the bed, washed her face in the basin, and began to brush the tangles from her hair. She caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the washstand and barely recognized the hollow-eyed woman staring back at her. Thomas would have been horrified to see her like this, she realized. He had always told her she was beautiful, and he had loved her laughter and her spirit. The best way to honor his memory was not to destroy herself with grief, but to find a way to carry him in her heart while still living. It would not be easy, she knew. There would still be hard days and difficult nights. But with Nathaniel's help, perhaps she could find her way through the darkness and back into the light. True to his word, Nathaniel returned that evening just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Clara was sitting in the boarding house parlor, attempting to do some needlework to keep her hands busy, when he appeared in the doorway. Several of the other boarders looked up with interest, having heard rumors about the mountain man who had spent the night in the widow's room. "Good evening, Clara," Nathaniel said formally. "Would you like to take a walk before it gets too dark? The air is pleasant." Clara set aside her needlework and stood up, grateful for the excuse to move. "I would like that very much." They stepped out onto the street together, and Clara was acutely aware of the curious stares that followed them. Nathaniel seemed oblivious to the attention, his focus entirely on her as he shortened his long strides to match her smaller steps. They walked to the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open meadows dotted with wildflowers, and the sound of the creek rushing over rocks provided a soothing background melody. "It is beautiful here," Clara said, breathing in the crisp mountain air. "Thomas and I used to talk about building a cabin somewhere like this, far from civilization, where we could wake up to this view every morning." "It is possible to do that," Nathaniel said carefully. "Not right away, of course, but someday, if it is still something you want." Clara glanced at him, surprised. "Do you live in a cabin?" "I do," Nathaniel confirmed. "About 30 miles north of here, up in the high country. It is small and rough, but it is mine. Built it myself over the course of 2 summers. There's a stream nearby for water, plenty of game for food, and peace like you cannot imagine. Sometimes I do not see another human being for months at a time." "Does not that get lonely?" Clara asked. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, watching an eagle soar overhead. "It did not used to," he admitted. "But lately, yes. I've been thinking it might be time to come down from the mountain, so to speak, to rejoin the world of people and see what kind of life I can build here." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, following the creek upstream until the town was just a cluster of buildings behind them. Clara found herself relaxing in Nathaniel's presence, the constant tension that had gripped her for weeks beginning to ease. There was something about his calm, steady energy that made her feel safe, as though nothing bad could happen while he was nearby. "Tell me about your life in Ohio," Nathaniel said as they settled on a large boulder near the water. "What was it like before you came west?" Clara smiled at the memory. "Quiet, simple. My father owned a small general store, and I helped him run it from the time I was old enough to count change. Thomas worked at his father's blacksmith shop next door. We grew up together, played together as children, and then one day when I was 16, I looked at him and realized he was not just my friend anymore. He was everything." "How old are you now?" Nathaniel asked. 22, Clara replied. "Though I feel about 100 years older." "You're young," Nathaniel said gently. "You have your whole life ahead of you. I know it does not feel like it right now, but there will be joy again. There will be love again, in whatever form it takes." Clara turned to look at him, really look at him, taking in the strong line of his jaw beneath his beard, the weather-worn creases around his eyes, the broad shoulders that looked like they could carry the weight of the world. "How old are you, Nathaniel?" 30, he replied. "Old enough to know better, young enough to still make plenty of mistakes." Clara laughed, surprising herself with the sound. It was small and rusty from disuse, but it was genuine. Nathaniel's face lit up at the sound, and she realized that his smiles were rare and therefore precious. As the sky darkened and stars began to appear overhead, they made their way back to the boarding house. Mrs. Caldwell greeted them at the door with a knowing look, but said nothing about the impropriety of an unchaperoned walk. Clara suspected the older woman was simply relieved that she seemed to be improving. That night, Nathaniel once again took up his post in the chair in Clara's room. She changed into her nightgown behind a privacy screen, then climbed into bed feeling self-conscious but also comforted by his presence. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Nathaniel told her about tracking bears through snowstorms and surviving an avalanche, about the time he had wrestled a mountain lion that attacked him and lived to tell the tale. And Clara told him about helping her father at the store, about teaching herself to read from newspapers and books, about her dream of one day having a real library full of stories from all over the world. Eventually, Clara's eyes grew heavy and her words began to slur with exhaustion. Nathaniel fell silent, and she drifted off to sleep with his presence wrapping around her like a protective blanket. This time, she did not cry at all. The pattern continued for the next 2 weeks. During the days, Nathaniel took jobs tracking game for the mines and hunting the mountain lions that had been troubling ranchers. He was good at what he did, efficient and skilled, and word of his abilities spread quickly through the region. He earned good money and respect, but his evenings always belonged to Clara. They would walk together, but sometimes going miles into the countryside, and she would talk about Thomas, gradually shifting from raw grief to fond remembrance. Other times they would sit in the boarding house parlor, and Nathaniel would whittle, while Clara read aloud from books borrowed from Reverend Michael's small collection, and every night, without fail, Nathaniel would sit in the chair in Clara's room while she slept, keeping watch over her like a guardian angel carved from muscle and mountain stone. The crying stopped entirely after the first week, and Clara began to eat regular meals and regain some of the weight she had lost. Color returned to her cheeks, and the haunted look began to fade from her eyes. The other boarders noticed the change and were grateful for the return of quiet nights. Though more than a few tongues wagged about the unusual relationship developing between the widow and the mountain man. Mrs. Caldwell kept her opinions to herself, but she watched the two of them carefully, seeing something she recognized from her own younger days. It was the beginning of love, tentative and unexpected, growing in the ruins of tragedy like a flower pushing through concrete. Clara was not ready to acknowledge her feelings, not yet. She was still mourning Thomas, still wearing black, still thinking of herself as a widow first and a woman second. But she could not deny that something had shifted in her heart. Nathaniel had become essential to her in ways that went beyond comfort and companionship. She found herself thinking about him during the day, looking forward to their evening walks, feeling a flutter in her stomach when she saw him coming up the street after a day of work. She noticed details about him that made her pulse quicken. The way his hands, so large and powerful, could handle tiny pieces of wood with incredible delicacy while whittling. The sound of his deep laugh when she said something that amused him. The gentleness in his eyes when he looked at her as though she were something precious that needed protecting. Nathaniel, for his part, was fighting his own battle. He had not expected to feel this way about Clara when he first knocked on her door. He had genuinely wanted to help someone in pain, to offer the kind of support he had refused when he was grieving. But somewhere along the way, between the late-night conversations and the sunset walks and the peaceful hours watching her sleep, he had fallen in love with her. It terrified him because he knew it was too soon, knew she was not ready, knew that pushing his feelings on her would be selfish and wrong. So he held his tongue and contented himself with being her friend and protector, telling himself that her healing was more important than his heart. One evening in late September, nearly a month after Nathaniel had first arrived in Silver Creek, they were walking along their usual route by the creek when Clara suddenly stopped and turned to face him. The setting sun caught in her hair, turning it reddish gold, and her eyes were bright with emotion. "Nathaniel, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Nathaniel's heart began to pound, but he kept his expression neutral. "All right. What is it?" Clara took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the first night we talked, about how Thomas would not want me to waste my life in grief. You were right. He would want me to heal, to find happiness again, and I think I am ready to start trying." "That's wonderful, Clara," Nathaniel said sincerely, even as part of him wondered if this was leading where he both hoped and feared it might. "What does that mean for you? What do you want to do?" "I want to live," Clara said simply. really live, not just exist. I want to honor Thomas's memory by being brave enough to embrace whatever comes next, and I want to be honest with you about something." She paused, searching for the right words. "You have become incredibly important to me, more important than I realized until recently. I do not know if it is too soon to feel this way, or if I am just confused because you have been so kind to me, but I think I am falling in love with you, Nathaniel, and I do not know what to do about it." The words hung in the air between them, and Nathaniel felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. He had imagined this moment 100 times, but now that it was actually happening, he did not know how to respond. He saw the vulnerability in Clara's face, the fear that she had said too much or revealed too much, and he knew he had to be completely honest with her. "Clara," he said, his deep voice rough with emotion, "I have been in love with you since the third night I sat in your room and watched you finally sleep peacefully. But I have been trying to hide it because I did not want to pressure you or make you feel obligated to me because of everything I have done for you. But if you are telling me that you might feel the same way, then I want you to know that I am not going anywhere. I will wait as long as you need. There is no rush, no deadline. We have all the time in the world." Tears streamed down Clara's face, but they were happy tears this time, tears of relief and joy. "I do not want to wait," she said. "I have already lost so much time to grief. Thomas is gone, and I will always love him, but he is gone. You are here, real and solid and alive, and I do not want to waste another moment pretending I do not feel what I feel." Nathaniel closed the distance between them in 2 long strides and cupped her face gently in his massive hands, his calloused thumbs wiping away her tears. "Are you sure?" he asked, searching her eyes for any doubt. "I need you to be absolutely certain, Clara, because once I kiss you, once we start down this path, I am not going to be able to go back. You are going to be mine, and I am going to be yours for as long as you will have me." "I am sure," Clara whispered, rising up on her toes to close the remaining distance between them. "Kiss me, Nathaniel. Please." Nathaniel lowered his head and captured her lips with his, and the world seemed to explode into color and light. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, both of them learning the shape and taste of each other. Then it deepened, becoming more passionate as weeks of suppressed longing came pouring out. Nathaniel wrapped his arms around Clara's small frame, pulling her close against his chest, and she clung to him like he was the only solid thing in a spinning world. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Nathaniel rested his forehead against Clara's, unwilling to let her go just yet. "I love you," he said, the words coming easily now that they were finally allowed. "I love you so much it scares me." "I love you too," Clara replied, her voice full of wonder. "I did not think I would ever feel this way again, but here you are, and here I am, and it feels right. Is that wrong? Am I betraying Thomas's memory?" "No," Nathaniel said firmly. "Love is not a finite resource, Clara. You can love Thomas for who he was and what you shared, and you can love me for who I am and what we might build together. The heart is big enough for both, and he would want you to be happy." Clara nodded, knowing in her soul that he was right. Thomas had been the most generous, loving person she had ever known, and he would have wanted her to find joy again, even if it was with someone else. She sent up a silent thank you to her late husband, feeling as though she had his blessing, and then she kissed Nathaniel again, pouring all her gratitude and hope and new love into the embrace. They walked back to the boarding house hand in hand, and when they entered the parlor, Mrs. Caldwell took one look at their glowing faces and clasped her hands together with satisfaction. "Well, it is about time," she declared, making several of the other boarders laugh. "I was beginning to think you two were going to dance around each other forever." "Mrs. Caldwell," Nathaniel said, and his arm wrapped protectively around Clara's shoulders. "I would like to speak with you about something. Clara and I would like to court properly, with your permission and oversight. I know there has been talk about the time I have spent in her room, and I do not want her reputation damaged any further." "Young man," Mrs. Caldwell said, her stern face softening, "anyone with eyes can see that your intentions toward Clara have been entirely honorable. But I appreciate you asking. You have my blessing to court her, and I will make sure everyone knows that you have behaved like a perfect gentleman." "Thank you," Clara said gratefully. She had not realized how much she had been worrying about what people thought until that moment. Over the following weeks, Nathaniel and Clara's courtship became the talk of Silver Creek. They were an unusual pair, the tiny widow in her mourning clothes and the massive mountain man who towered over everyone else in town, but there was something undeniably romantic about their story. Nathaniel courted Clara with old-fashioned courtesy, bringing her flowers he picked in the high meadows, taking her on long rides through the mountains on a borrowed horse, teaching her to identify animal tracks and bird calls. Clara, in turn, brought light and warmth back into Nathaniel's life, reminding him what it felt like to be part of something larger than himself. Mrs. Caldwell continued to chaperone their time together, though everyone knew it was mostly for appearances. The truth was that Nathaniel had more self-control than any man Mrs. Caldwell had ever met. He treated Clara like she was made of spun glass, always careful, always respectful, never pushing her further than she was ready to go. They still spent their evenings together, but now Nathaniel stayed in the parlor or on the front porch rather than in Clara's room, and they talked and laughed with the easy intimacy of people who had seen each other at their worst and still chosen to stay. As autumn deepened and the aspen trees turned gold against the green of the pines, Nathaniel began to make plans for their future. He had been working steadily since his arrival in Silver Creek and had saved a significant amount of money. He spoke with the land office about purchasing property near his mountain cabin, thinking that Clara might enjoy the solitude and beauty of the high country if he built her a proper house with real windows and a good stove. He talked to carpenters about timber and nails, to the general store owner about ordering supplies, to everyone who might help him create a home worthy of the woman he loved. But he did not propose right away. Clara was healing, growing stronger every day, but she was still wearing mourning clothes and still sometimes woke in the night crying for Thomas. Nathaniel wanted to give her time to fully process her grief, to be absolutely certain that she was choosing him because she loved him, not because she was afraid of being alone. So he waited, patient as the mountains themselves, content to build their relationship on a foundation of friendship and trust that would last a lifetime. Clara, meanwhile, was gradually coming back to herself. She put away her black dresses and began wearing colors again, soft blues and greens that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes. She started helping Mrs. Caldwell with tasks around the boarding house, cooking and cleaning and making herself useful, grateful for the kindness the older woman had shown her. She wrote letters to her family back in Ohio, telling them about Thomas's death, but also about Nathaniel, about this unexpected second chance at happiness that had walked into her life in the form of a mountain man with gentle hands and a loyal heart. By the time winter began to settle over the mountains, dusting the peaks with fresh snow and bringing cold winds down into the valley, Clara knew without a doubt that she wanted to spend the rest of her life with Nathaniel. She had made peace with Thomas's death, had said her proper goodbyes in the quiet of her heart, and was ready to move forward. But still Nathaniel did not ask the question she was waiting to hear, and she began to wonder if perhaps he had changed his mind, if he had decided that she was too much trouble or too damaged to be worth the effort. She need not have worried. Nathaniel was simply waiting for the right moment, and that moment came on a crisp December afternoon when he took Clara on one final journey before winter truly set in. He borrowed horses from the livery and packed supplies, and they rode out of Silver Creek heading north into the high country. Clara, bundled in a heavy coat and gloves that Nathaniel had bought for her, looked around with wonder as they climbed higher and higher, the air growing thinner and colder, but also cleaner and more invigorating. After several hours of riding, they emerged into a valley that took Clara's breath away. It was surrounded on three sides by towering peaks, and their slopes covered in dark pine forests, and a crystal-clear stream wound through the center, its banks lined with willows and cottonwoods. Near the stream stood a small cabin, rough but sturdy, with smoke curling from its stone chimney. And beside the cabin, the framework of a much larger structure was taking shape, the fresh-cut logs still golden with sap. "What is this?" Clara asked, her voice filled with awe. Nathaniel dismounted and came around to lift her down from her horse, his hands spanning her waist easily. "This is my cabin," he said, gesturing to the smaller structure, "and that," he pointed to the framework, "is going to be our house, if you will have me, that is." Clara's heart began to race. On our house? Nathaniel took both of her hands in his and looked down at her with an expression so full of love that it made her knees weak. Clara Hartwell, I know we have not been courting very long, at least not officially, but I have known from the first night I met you that you were going to change my life. You have brought me back from the isolation I built around myself, reminded me what it means to care about someone more than I care about my own safety or comfort. I want to build a life with you here in this valley, where we can wake up to beauty every morning and go to sleep counting stars every night. I want to fill that house with love and laughter, and someday, if you want, with children who will grow up strong and free in these mountains. Will you marry me, Clara? Will you be my wife? Tears streamed down Clara's face, but she was smiling so wide her cheeks hurt. Yes, she said, her voice ringing out clear and strong in the mountain air. Yes, Nathaniel, I will marry you. I love you so much, and I cannot think of anything I want more than to build a life with you here. Nathaniel let out a whoop of joy that echoed off the surrounding peaks, then swept Clara up in his arms and spun her around, her laughter mixing with his in a sound of pure happiness. When he finally set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, pouring all his love and relief and excitement into the embrace, and Clara kissed him back with equal fervor, no longer afraid or uncertain about her feelings. They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the valley and the cabin, Nathaniel pointing out where he planned to put the barn and chicken coop, where Clara could have a garden in the spring, where a small orchard might thrive. He showed her the inside of his cabin, small and spare but clean, with a good stove and a comfortable bed. He explained that they could live there while he finished building the main house, which would have 3 bedrooms, a real kitchen, a sitting room, and even a small library where Clara could keep her books. You remembered, Clara said softly, touching the space he had framed out for the library. I mentioned wanting a library just once. I remember everything you have ever told me, Nathaniel replied, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on top of her head. Every dream, every wish, every fear. I want to spend the rest of my life making sure your dreams come true and your fears never do. They rode back to Silver Creek as the sun was setting, arriving just as the dinner bell was ringing at the boarding house. Nathaniel helped Clara down from her horse, and they walked inside hand in hand, their faces glowing with joy. Mrs. Caldwell took one look at them and immediately started crying happy tears. He asked you, she said, not even making it a question, and you said yes. I said yes, Clara confirmed, holding out her hand to show the simple gold band that Nathaniel had slipped onto her finger, a ring that had belonged to his mother and was the only piece of family jewelry he had saved from the fire. The other boarders crowded around to offer congratulations, and even grumpy old Pete Hannigan cracked a genuine smile. A spontaneous celebration broke out, with Mrs. Caldwell breaking out a bottle of elderberry wine she had been saving for a special occasion, and someone producing a fiddle for music. They danced in the parlor, Nathaniel careful not to crush Clara's feet with his big boots, and everyone agreed it was the most romantic thing that had happened in Silver Creek in years. That night, for the first time since Thomas's death, Clara went to sleep with a smile on her face and hope in her heart, dreaming not of the past but of the future she was going to build with Nathaniel. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church at the center of town, with Reverend Michaels officiating and what seemed like the entire population of Silver Creek in attendance. Clara wore a simple but beautiful dress that Martha Henderson had sewn for her as a wedding gift, soft blue wool with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Nathaniel wore new clothes purchased from the general store, black trousers and a white shirt that strained slightly across his broad shoulders, his long hair neatly combed and his beard freshly trimmed. He looked uncomfortable in the formal attire, but devastatingly handsome, and when Clara walked down the aisle toward him, the expression on his face made every woman in the church sigh with envy. The ceremony was brief but moving, and when Reverend Michaels pronounced them husband and wife, Nathaniel kissed Clara with such tender reverence that more than a few people had to wipe away tears. The reception was held in the church basement, with food provided by various townspeople and music played by a small group of miners who proved surprisingly talented with their instruments. Nathaniel and Clara danced together, ate cake, and accepted the well wishes of their friends and neighbors, both of them glowing with happiness. As the sun began to set, they said their goodbyes and climbed into a wagon that Nathaniel had loaded with supplies, and wedding gifts. They were heading up to the valley that would be their home, planning to spend the winter in Nathaniel's cabin while he worked on finishing the main house. Clara felt a flutter of nervousness as they left the town behind, not about marrying Nathaniel, but about the intimacy that awaited them. She was not entirely innocent, having been married to Thomas, but that seemed like a lifetime ago, and this was different. This was Nathaniel, her mountain man, and she wanted everything between them to be perfect. Nathaniel seemed to sense her nerves. He reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "We do not have to rush anything," he said quietly. "Tonight or any night. I meant what I said in my vows. I'm going to spend the rest of my life cherishing you, and that means respecting your pace." Clara squeezed his hand gratefully. "I'm not afraid," she said, and realized it was true. "Just a little nervous, but I want this, Nathaniel. I want you. I am ready." They reached the cabin just as the last light was fading from the sky, and Nathaniel carried Clara over the threshold, making her laugh with the traditional gesture. He had prepared the cabin for her arrival, bringing in wildflowers despite the cold weather, hanging curtains at the windows, and making sure there was plenty of firewood stacked by the door. A fire was already burning in the stove, filling the small space with warmth and light, and Clara felt a wave of emotion wash over her as she realized that this was her home now. Not a boarding house room where she cried herself to sleep every night, but a real home with a man who loved her. Nathaniel set her down gently and cupped her face in his hands. "I love you, Clara Cross," he said, using her new name for the first time. "Thank you for trusting me with your heart." "I love you too," Clara replied, rising up to kiss him. "Thank you for saving me." They came together slowly, taking their time to explore and discover, and what had started as gentle quickly became passionate as weeks of restrained desire finally found release. Nathaniel was careful with Clara, mindful of his size and strength, but she surprised him with her own fierce hunger, pulling him closer and urging him on. They made love by firelight on the big bed in the corner of the cabin, and it was everything Clara had hoped for, and more. Nathaniel was both powerful and tender, claiming her completely while also making her feel cherished and safe. And when they finally lay tangled together in exhausted satisfaction, Clara knew beyond all doubt that she had made the right choice. "Are you all right?" Nathaniel asked, stroking her hair back from her flushed face. "I did not hurt you?" "You did not hurt me," Clara assured him, pressing a kiss to his chest. "That was perfect. You are perfect." "Not perfect," Nathaniel corrected with a smile, "but perfect for you. Pray, I hope." "Perfect for me," Clara agreed, and fell asleep wrapped in his arms, safe and loved and home. The winter passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Nathaniel spent his days working on the new house whenever the weather permitted, and Clara made the cabin into a cozy home, learning to cook on the wood stove and keep house in the rustic conditions. It was very different from her life in Ohio, or even her time at the boarding house, but she thrived in the solitude and simplicity of mountain living. She loved waking up next to Nathaniel every morning, loved watching him work with wood and tools, loved the quiet evenings they spent reading aloud to each other or playing cards or simply talking. They made trips down to Silver Creek every few weeks for supplies and to visit with friends, and everyone marveled at the transformation in Clara. The pale, grief-stricken widow who had cried every night was gone, replaced by a healthy, rosy-cheeked woman who radiated contentment. Mrs. Caldwell took full credit for the match, declaring loudly to anyone who would listen that she had known from the moment Nathaniel arrived that he was exactly what Clara needed. As spring approached and the snow began to melt, the house really took shape. Nathaniel had hired a few men from town to help with the heavy work, and by the time the first flowers were pushing up through the thawing ground, the structure was essentially complete. Clara walked through the rooms with tears of joy in her eyes, unable to believe that this beautiful home was really hers. The library Nathaniel had promised her was everything she had dreamed of, with built-in shelves already waiting for books and a large window that looked out over the valley. The kitchen was spacious and well-designed, with a big cast-iron stove and a table where they could share meals. The bedrooms were generous, sized with future children in mind, and the sitting room had a massive stone fireplace that Nathaniel had built with his own hands. They moved in on a bright May morning, carrying their few possessions from the cabin to the big house, and that night they made love in their new bedroom, christening the space with laughter and passion. Afterward, lying in Nathaniel's arms with moonlight streaming through the windows, Clara felt such complete happiness that it almost frightened her. She had learned the hard way how quickly joy could be stolen, how fragile life really was. "What are you thinking?" Nathaniel asked, his deep voice rumbling in her ear. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am," Clara admitted, "and how scared I am of losing this." Nathaniel tightened his arms around her. "Nothing in life is guaranteed," he said honestly. "I cannot promise that nothing bad will ever happen to us, but I can promise that whatever comes, we will face it together. You are not alone anymore, Clara. You will never be alone again." His words gave her comfort, and she snuggled closer to him, breathing in his scent of pine and wood smoke and mountain air. "Together," she repeated. "I like the sound of that." Summer came to the high country in an explosion of wildflowers and green grass, and Clara discovered that she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had not wanted to say anything until she was certain. When she finally told Nathaniel, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. His face lit up with such pure joy that it made her heart swell, and he immediately swept her up in a careful hug, mindful of the precious cargo she was carrying. "We are going to have a baby," he said wonderingly, setting her down and placing his large hand over her still flat stomach. "A little person who is part you and part me. Clara, I do not have words for how happy that makes me." "Me too," Clara said, laughing and crying at the same time. "I'm so happy, Nathaniel. After everything we have been through, all the loss and grief, to have this new life growing inside me feels like a miracle." Nathaniel kissed her thoroughly, then immediately began fussing over her, insisting she sit down and rest, asking if she needed anything, and wondering if they should send for a doctor right away. Clara laughed at his overprotective behavior, but secretly loved it, knowing it came from a place of deep love and care. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Clara bloomed with health and happiness. Nathaniel continued to be attentive to the point of being comical, refusing to let her lift anything heavy or do any task he deemed too strenuous. He built a rocking chair for the nursery, carved toys for the baby who was still months away from arrival, and read every book about childbirth and infant care that Reverend Michaels could lend him. Clara teased him about being nervous, but she appreciated his dedication and involvement. As autumn arrived and Clara's belly grew round and heavy, they made preparations for the birth. A midwife from Silver Creek, a capable woman named Mrs. Patterson, agreed to come and stay with them when the time grew near. Nathaniel laid in supplies and made sure the house was stocked with everything they might need. He also began teaching Clara some of his wilderness skills, wanting to make sure she could survive on her own if anything ever happened to him. She learned to shoot his rifle, to identify edible plants, to read weather signs and animal tracks. It gave them both peace of mind to know that she was capable and competent. On a cold November night, with snow falling softly outside the windows, Clara went into labor. Mrs. Patterson and Nathaniel were both by her side, and the birth was long and difficult, but ultimately successful. Just after dawn, Clara delivered a healthy baby boy who had his father's strong lungs and his mother's dark hair. Nathaniel held his son for the first time, with tears streaming down his face, this giant of a man reduced to emotional speechlessness by the tiny bundle in his arms. "He is perfect," Nathaniel whispered, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed so Clara could see. "Absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" Clara reached out to touch her son's soft cheek, overcome with love. "I want to name him Thomas," she said quietly, "after my first husband, not to replace him or to live in the past, but to honor his memory and acknowledge that he was part of the journey that led me to you. Would that be all right?" Nathaniel looked at his wife with such love and admiration that Clara felt it like a physical touch. "It would be more than all right," he said. "Thomas Cross. It is a strong name for what I am sure will be a strong boy." They spent the next hours simply marveling at their son, counting his tiny fingers and toes, watching him sleep and eat and make the small sounds that new babies make. Mrs. Patterson eventually shooed Nathaniel out so Clara could rest, and he reluctantly left the bedroom, though he did not go far. Clara could hear him pacing in the sitting room, too excited and overwhelmed to sleep. As Clara drifted off with little Thomas nestled in her arms, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the girl she had been in Ohio, naive and sheltered, who had loved Thomas Hartwell with all her heart. She thought about the devastating grief of losing him, the endless nights of crying that had driven her neighbors to distraction. She thought about the moment Nathaniel Cross had knocked on her door, a mountain man with gentle eyes and strong hands who had sat with her in the darkness and refused to let her drown in her sorrow. She would always love Thomas. He would always be her first love, the boy who had brought her wildflowers and made her laugh. But Nathaniel was her true love, her forever love, the man who had seen her at her absolute worst and chosen to love her anyway. He had held her while she cried, waited while she healed, and built her a home in the mountains where they could raise their family in peace and beauty. The crying had finally ended, replaced by laughter and joy and the bright promise of the future. And Clara knew, with absolute certainty, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The years that followed were filled with the kind of happiness that Clara had once thought was lost to her forever. Little Thomas grew into a sturdy, adventurous boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to track and hunt and survive in the wilderness. 2 years after Thomas's birth, Clara gave birth to a daughter they named Hope, a beautiful girl with her father's blue eyes and sunny disposition. And 3 years after that, another son arrived, whom they named Samuel after Nathaniel's father. The house in the valley rang with the sounds of children playing, with laughter and occasional arguments and the organized chaos of family life. Nathaniel proved to be a wonderful father, patient and playful, teaching his children about the natural world, while also making sure they learned to read and do arithmetic. Clara homeschooled them, using books ordered from back east, and their little library gradually filled with volumes on every subject imaginable. They still made regular trips down to Silver Creek, where their children played with the town kids and Clara caught up with friends. Mrs. Caldwell doted on the Cross children, always having cookies or small treats ready when they visited the boarding house. Martha Henderson sewed clothes for them as they grew, and Reverend Michaels baptized each child in the small church where Nathaniel and Clara had been married. The story of how they met became something of a legend in Silver Creek. People loved to talk about the widow who cried every night and the mountain man who had held her until the crying finally ended, about the unlikely love story that had bloomed from tragedy and grief. Young couples would ask Clara and Nathaniel for advice about marriage, and they always gave the same answer: face everything together, communicate honestly, and never let pride or anger come between you and the person you love. As the children grew older and more independent, Nathaniel and Clara found time to reconnect as a couple, taking long rides through the mountains like they had during their courtship, sitting together on the porch in the evenings watching the sunset behind the peaks. They still talked for hours about everything and nothing, still laughed at each other's jokes, still looked at each other with the kind of love that made their children roll their eyes and declare them embarrassing. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Nathaniel took Clara back to the spot by the creek where he had first kissed her. They stood together in the fading light, and Nathaniel wrapped his arms around his wife, marveling at how far they had come. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Choosing me, choosing this life? It is isolated up here, far from your family and the world you knew." Clara turned in his arms to look up at him, her dark eyes serious. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "You gave me back my life, Nathaniel. You pulled me out of the darkness and showed me that it was possible to love again, to be happy again. This life we have built together, this family, this home in the mountains, it is everything I never knew I needed. I would choose you 1,000 times over, in any life, in any circumstance." Nathaniel kissed her deeply, pouring a decade's worth of love and gratitude into the embrace. "I love you." "Clara Cross," he said when they finally broke apart. "I loved you when you were broken. I loved you when you were healing, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Clara replied, her voice thick with emotion. "My mountain man, my protector, my heart." They stood there as the stars began to appear overhead, holding each other close, and Clara thought about the neighbors who had once groaned at the sound of her crying every night. They had been right to be concerned, she supposed. The grief had been consuming her, destroying her from the inside out. But then Nathaniel had knocked on her door, had offered his strength and compassion without expecting anything in return, and everything had changed. The crying had ended. The healing had begun. And from the ashes of her first love, a new love had grown, or stronger and deeper than she could have imagined. It was not about forgetting Thomas or pretending that loss had never happened. It was about honoring his memory by living fully, by choosing joy over despair, by opening her heart to love again even when it seemed impossible. Years continued to pass, marked by the changing of the seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. Thomas Jr. grew tall and strong like his father, eventually taking over much of the hunting and tracking work that Nathaniel had done in his younger years. Hope became a skilled seamstress and teacher, helping her mother educate the younger children in the valley who were too far from town to attend proper school. Samuel developed a talent for woodworking, creating beautiful furniture and carvings that he sold in Silver Creek and beyond. Nathaniel's hair began to show streaks of silver, and Clara found a few gray strands in her own dark locks, but they aged together gracefully, their love deepening rather than diminishing with time. They became the elders of their small mountain community, the couple that younger people looked to for wisdom and example. And whenever someone came to them struggling with loss or grief, they would share their story about how love could heal even the deepest wounds, about how holding someone in their darkest moments could light the way back to joy. On a warm summer evening when Nathaniel was 55 and Clara was 47, they sat together on the porch of their home, watching their grandchildren play in the meadow below. Thomas Jr. had married a girl from Silver Creek, and they had 2 children of their own, energetic little beings who adored their grandfather and begged him for stories about his adventures in the wilderness. "We did all right, did we not?" Nathaniel said, reaching over to take Clara's hand. "Built a good life, raised good children, created something that will last beyond us." "We did more than all right," Clara replied, squeezing his hand. "We did beautifully, and it all started because you refused to let me cry alone." Nathaniel smiled, that rare, transformative smile that Clara still loved after all these years. "Best decision I ever made, knocking on your door that night, changed both our lives." "You saved my life," Clara corrected gently, "and then you gave me a new one, better than anything I could have imagined. I hope you know how grateful I am every single day." "I know," Nathaniel said simply, "because I feel the same way. You saved me too, Clara. Brought me down from the mountain and gave me a reason to rejoin the world. We saved each other." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, listening to the laughter of their grandchildren and the rustle of wind through the pine trees. The valley spread out before them, unchanged by the passage of time, still as beautiful and peaceful as it had been the day Nathaniel first brought Clara here and asked her to marry him. Clara thought about the young widow she had once been, consumed by grief, crying every night until the neighbors complained. She thought about how lost and broken she had felt, convinced that happiness was something that happened to other people but never again to her. And she thought about the mountain man who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not even known to say, who had sat with her in the darkness and promised that she would not have to face the pain alone. The crying had ended that night, when Nathaniel held her and gave her permission to grieve while also refusing to let the grief consume her. And in its place had come this incredible life, full of love and family and purpose. It had not been easy. There had been challenges and hardships, harsh winters and difficult times, moments when Clara had doubted herself or struggled with memories of what she had lost. But Nathaniel had always been there, solid and steady as the mountains themselves, ready to catch her if she stumbled and celebrate with her when she triumphed. As the last light faded and the first stars appeared, Nathaniel and Clara rose from their chairs and walked inside together, hand in hand as they had been for 25 years. Their home was full of warmth and light, full of the evidence of a life well lived, photographs on the walls, books on the shelves, toys scattered on the floor from visiting grandchildren. It was everything they had built together, everything they had dreamed of during those long talks in the middle of the night when Clara was healing and Nathaniel was falling in love. That night, as they lay in their bed with the window open to let in the cool mountain air, Clara rested her head on Nathaniel's chest and listened to the steady beating of his heart. It was the same heart that had been brave enough to reach out to a stranger in pain, compassionate enough to sit with her through endless nights of tears, strong enough to carry both of them through the darkness and into the light. "Thank you," she whispered, "not for the first time and certainly not for the last. For everything. For seeing me when I was invisible, for hearing me when all anyone else could hear was noise, for loving me when I thought I would never be loved again." Nathaniel pressed a kiss to the top of her head and pulled her closer. "Always," he promised, his deep voice wrapping around her like a warm blanket. "I will always see you, always hear you, always love you. From the moment I first heard you crying through that wall, you have been mine to protect and cherish, and I take that responsibility seriously." Clara smiled into the darkness, secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. The young widow who had cried every night until the neighbors groaned was gone, transformed into a woman who knew her own strength, who had survived the worst and come out the other side stronger and wiser. And it was all because a mountain man with massive shoulders and a gentle heart had refused to walk away from someone in pain. The crying had finally ended, replaced by laughter and love and the certain knowledge that they would face whatever came next together. And as sleep claimed them both, Clara sent up a silent thank you to the universe for bringing Nathaniel Cross into her life, for giving her a second chance at happiness, for proving that love could bloom even in the darkest soil. Their story became part of the fabric of Silver Creek. It passed down through generations as an example of the healing power of compassion and the transformative nature of love. Children grew up hearing about the widow and the mountain man, about how a simple act of kindness had blossomed into a legendary romance. And whenever someone in town was struggling with loss or grief, someone would inevitably say, "Remember Clara Cross. Remember how she cried every night until Nathaniel held her and the crying finally ended. If she could find her way back to joy, so can you." Years later, when both Nathaniel and Clara had passed on peacefully in their old age, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the people of Silver Creek erected a small monument in the town square. It was a simple stone marker with an inscription that read, "In memory of Nathaniel and Clara Cross, who taught us that love heals all wounds, that compassion changes lives, and that the darkest night always gives way to dawn. May their story inspire us to reach out to those in pain and hold them until the crying finally ends." And in the valley high in the mountains, their house still stood, occupied now by their descendants who continued to live according to the values Nathaniel and Clara had instilled in them. Work hard, love deeply, protect those who cannot protect themselves, and never be afraid to sit with someone in their darkness until they find their way back to the light. The legacy of the widow, who cried every night, and the mountain man who held her lived on, a testament to the enduring power of love and the beautiful truth that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a simple knock on a door and a willingness to say, "You do not have to face this alone. I am here. I will stay. And together, we will make it through." In the end, that was what mattered most. Not the grand gestures or the dramatic moments, but the quiet decision to show up for someone day after day, night after night, until the healing was complete and the crying finally ended. It was a lesson their children carried forward, and their children after them, creating ripples of compassion and kindness that spread far beyond the small mining town where it all began. And somewhere in the mountains, in the whisper of wind through pine trees and the rush of cold water over ancient stones, the spirits of Nathaniel and Clara Cross watched over the valley they had loved, a content in the knowledge that their story would never be forgotten and their love would continue to inspire others for generations to come. The crying had ended. The love remained. And that was the best legacy anyone could ask for.